These should be all the tools you will need to install the Hayden Automotive 679 transmission cooler. This already comes with its own 3/8 hose, but you will need more. This is 10 feet. We will be using these provided zip ties that go through the radiator and the foam. The foam will reduce vibrations and should provide just a bit of space between the condenser and the cooler, which is what you would want for optimal cooling capacity. This wrench will be for this, which is a future project. It's capped off because I do not have a temperature sensor yet, but I'm going to put this on the cold line. Teflon tape to make sure these threads do not leak. You'll need these barb fittings because we'll be cutting into soft line and we need to connect the ends together. And of course, hose clamps. 2 different tools to tighten the hose clamps depending on how much room we have. 2 different Phillips head screwdrivers. Not necessary, but having this is pretty useful to remove the screws that hold the grill in place, because it'll hold the screw for you as you back it out or put it back in. Something to cut the hose, and this will be for the zip ties to hold everything in place. Of course, we want more transmission fluid. I suggest checking the level before we do this so we know roughly where to refill it. A lot of these tools are optional because I have a reproduction of the splash guard and I have installed a factory skid plate. In order to uninstall, we have these bolts that go through the cross member or whatever this thing is called. This should be easy to unscrew using one of these. The vice grips are to hold the bolts in place. So there's nothing that holds these in place. Have to grab them gently, try to get them in the groove so you don't ruin your bolt. And there's one bolt up here. These are all replacement bolts, so mine is a 17 millimeter. There would be another one on this side, but unfortunately, when I got this in the junkyard, I had to cut it off. So that's one easy step. And we will be using this to pop those tabs off in order to remove, or at least partially remove, this splash cover, because this is covering the lines that we need to get to. As we can see, the rear line that goes into the back of the transmission is where we want to cut into. So that is typically the bottom line coming up here. I finally have the skid plate off. I just folded the cover over, and as we can see again, the rear line that goes into the back of the transmission is the cold return line, or this bottom line leads to this hose and a convenient spot to then route hoses through any of these holes up in there. The other side of the line may be more difficult to get to. You can see it right there, covered in some type of mesh. Not really sure. I may do something different in the future for the hot temperature. For now, we will just work on cutting this line, adding hose to it, and routing it up there. My next step will be to remove the grill and the headlight bezels. To remove the headlight bezels because they overlap on the grill. Normally there is 4 in total, 2 for each headlight bezel. Mine are missing, so I only have the one in the corner. Same thing on this side. And then we have 4 screws holding the grill in place. Alright, so this cooler is an 11 by 11 and it still fits. Just gotta tuck it in. These zip ties though, I worry because they don't necessarily fit. You can kind of force them through the fins and they do open up. I guess we'll find out. But we will have to remove the electrical fan. Might be able to keep this in place, the fan shroud. In order to remove the electrical fan, you have to remove 2 8mm bolts and disconnect the connector and then kind of shimmy it out. Some people like to take the hose off, which you probably should do. In my case, I try to stretch it over and force it out because I don't want to ruin the hoses. Old vehicles, you know how they be. In order to take the connector off, normally there is a little red locking tab you have to pull out, and then you push this down, which then unlocks it. This is an example of a non-broken connector. This locking tab gets pulled up and then you can depress the lock. Pretty cool feature about these foam pads, they actually have a small hole in them. So if you go through it, pop the plug out, these foam pads will go directly on these holes. There's a mock-up for you. I assume the pad goes on this side. You then throw this in, and now you have a nice little sandwich. So a little bit of a decent amount of space between your cooler and your condenser. I managed to get the tabs in, but they are very destructive. These are fins off of the condenser and the radiator. Let's see here. One coming through there. One coming through here. And you can see failed attempt basically bends the fins in a very not cool manner. I mean, if you can get them in right, you know, they might look like that one. But for the most part, these may be a bad idea. Besides the amount of damage they may do to the fins, as you can see, there is no leaking. But I will now demonstrate the flat end with the teeth goes up against the radiator. A little bit difficult to get them started. Once you get them on, you can obviously hold the end of this, push it all the way against the radiator. What I like to do is once it's up against there lightly, just push this fully seated while also holding the tab down and pushing from both sides to make sure you get a tight fit on this. I was able to make them fit and cut off the excess even with the fan shroud and the fan in the way. It's a little bit of finagling, but standard size snips will fit and you'll be able to cut them. One thing I did forget to mention before installing, a lot of people like to put it on this side in a hotter climate, so it's always getting cooled. Some people like to put it on this side in a colder climate, so it only cools when the engine is overheating. Sometimes they will set it on to a manual switch so they can turn on the switch. Since I'm a bit OCD, I just put it in the middle. I hear that works also, no problem. For the fittings, that you will either have one that already has the temperature sensor going through. I have them. I just don't have the temperature sensor, so using a block. But for every fitting, you want to put some Teflon tape. I went over this one about 3 times, and you want to put it in the direction that this turns in. So you wrap this way, so as you're threading in, it keeps the Teflon from unraveling itself. Two tips. Install the hoses before you put this in here. The top one was easy, but then the bottom one was not easy at all, and I couldn't get it all the way. But it should be fine enough. But the main tip is, if you do put this in before putting the hoses on, put some cardboard here, because those fins are very sharp. And for some reason, the inside edge of these are very sharp also. So be careful. Okay, so once you have everything connected, I wired or routed my lines. Use a zip tie along this pole into this hole here. Comes through this hole, routing my wires up through here. The top line is the line you want the transmission fluid to go into to try and force any air bubbles out. So it goes into this line coming from the fitting here. The bottom line you connect to the return right here. I added some of this wire loom housing, because this is potentially could rub on that. I placed this here. While I was checking for leaks, I also shook this around to make sure you get the air bubbles out. But again, we check for leaks. Check each spot, and since there are no leaks, we're basically done. Just want to secure some wires, secure the hoses in place where you want them to be, where they won't chafe or rub too much. This should be fine right here, and these wires will have to get pushed up here. Should have enough room for the skid plate. You have a little bit of cavity here where you can still have space for all of this to go through. And let's see. Just make sure everything is secure. Nothing is gonna rattle or rub. When you are refilling the transmission, you don't need a lot of fluid. You can barely see how much fluid I actually used. While you are refilling, you're going to want to have the car running, of course. Get it up to temperature, or at least halfway there. And you're going to want to cycle through each of these gears probably leave it in there for 3 to 5 seconds. Park, reverse, neutral, drive, 3, 1, 2, and then back up. I went through here multiple times to make sure you get all the fluid where it needs to be, make sure everything's moving and everything sounds correct. In order to check the level accurately, you must leave it in neutral. So activate your handbrake. Hopefully you have one that works. And then you will proceed to check the fluid level to make sure it is at the right level. And I believe that's it. That is how to install transmission cooler on Jeep Cherokee XJ.